The movie begins with Alicia, Daniel, and Chris driving to a hiking spot. During the trip, Daniel steps out to take a break, leaving Chris and Alicia alone. They debate whether to tell Daniel about their past hookup, given that Daniel and Alicia are now together. Alicia insists there's no need, though Chris feels guilty. Daniel soon returns, and they drive to a location he claims was once a war zone filled with landmines, bombs, and traps. The three continue their hike and eventually reach the top of a rock. Out of nowhere, Daniel suggests that Chris should propose to Alicia. Chris is stunned, but Daniel insists, saying he wanted his best friend to be part of the moment. Hesitantly, Chris follows through with the proposal. Later that night, as they sit around a bonfire, Daniel notices that Chris doesn't seem happy. He repeatedly asks what's wrong, but Chris stays silent. Daniel reassures him that everything will be fine. Daniel and Alicia spend time together in the tent, though Chris still looks uneasy. The next morning, Chris wakes up to find a stranger named DV rummaging through their belongings. Startled, Chris tries to attack him, but DV insists he's with Daniel and Alicia. Chris, still suspicious, believes DV was trying to steal from them. However, Daniel and Alicia soon arrive, confirming DV is a friend. Realizing his mistake, Chris apologizes. DV explains he was only looking for Alicia's camera to take a picture for them. Now that he has it, he sets up the shot and instructs them on where to stand. But just as he's about to take the photo, his expression turns to terror. Chris has stepped on a landmine. He warns everyone not to move, or the explosion could kill them all. Shocked and panicked, Daniel and Alicia follow DV's advice and take cover behind a rock. Daniel begs DV to go get help, but DV warns it will take at least 4 hours to reach town, too long for such a dangerous situation. Still, they have no other option, so DV leaves. Daniel tries to keep Chris calm, reminding him not to move, after some time, stepping further away to make a phone call. However, when he returns, he tells Alicia that the person he called said there was no help available. Alicia is stunned. She and Daniel return to Chris, and she asks if he told Daniel the truth. Chris apologizes, and Alicia finally confesses to Daniel about her past with Chris. She says she wanted to tell him, but when he proposed, she panicked. Daniel then reveals the shocking truth he already knew. He planned the entire situation, and it was DV's idea to use the landmine. Smirking, he places a shovel beside Chris, telling Alicia that if she wants to save him, she must dig a trench so Chris can jump in. However, he doesn't guarantee the plan will work. He also admits that his phone call was fake. There was never any signal in that area. Alicia desperately pleads with him to stop his twisted plan, but Daniel remains unmoved. Chris begins to question whether the landmine is even active. Without hesitation, Daniel yanks a chain attached to it and tosses it aside, claiming he had just armed it. Now, if Chris steps off, the bomb will explode, killing both him and Alicia if she doesn't get to safety. With that, Daniel walks away, meeting up with DV, who never actually left. He was watching the situation unfold from a distance, amused. Daniel, however, convinces him to leave, suggesting they go to a club instead. Back at the site, Alicia finds the chain Daniel threw away. She attempts to reattach it to the landmine, but she's unsure if it works. Afraid to risk Chris's life, she sticks to plan B, digging the trench. As she digs, a man named Ilya watches them from afar with his dog. The dog suddenly runs toward Chris, and Alicia instinctively swings the shovel to stop it. Ilya misinterprets her actions, thinking she's trying to harm his pet. Furious, he pulls out a gun and threatens them. He orders Chris to move, but Alicia frantically explains that he can't, or he'll trigger a bomb. Ilya doesn't believe her and demands to know what body they're burying, having assumed she was digging a grave. After she explains the situation in more detail, he starts to understand. Wanting to help, Ilya asks what he can do. Alicia hands him a shovel and begs him to dig while she fetches him some water from the tent. However, as soon as she steps away, curious about how they ended up in this situation, he asks Alicia to explain. She hesitates at first, but eventually tells him. However, instead of sympathy, Ilya insults her, calling her a derogatory name. Chris immediately snaps, warning Ilya that he can leave if he doesn't want to help. But Ilya says he does want to help, only if he gets something in return. Alicia offers him everything in her backpack, and Ilya goes through it. However, when he finds a piece of her clothing, he dismisses it, saying he isn't interested in material things. Instead, he makes a disturbing demand. He wants the clothes she's currently wearing. Chris and Alicia are both horrified, refusing outright. Chris even offers money instead, but Ilya refuses, saying that's not what he wants. Desperate to find another way, Chris suddenly suggests stepping off the landmine, believing that Alicia successfully reattached the chain Daniel had thrown away. But to his disappointment, she confesses that she lied. She only said that to keep him calm. Realizing they have no other choice, Alicia reluctantly gives Ilya what he wants. He finally starts digging, but his efforts are minimal. Suddenly, they hear a voice from a radio in Ilya's backpack. Chris and Alicia are shocked. He had a way to call for help all along. Speaking in a foreign language, Ilya responds to the person on the radio. Alicia begs him to hand over the device so they can ask for help, but he refuses unless she humiliates herself. He demands that she crawl like a dog and bring him her underwear. Chris explodes with rage, cursing Ilya, but the insult doesn't faze him. Alicia, despite her disgust, does what he asks in order to get the radio. When she finally gets it, she desperately asks for help, but the response comes in a language she doesn't understand. She pleads with Ilya to translate, but he smirks and tells her it will cost her. She has to remove a piece of clothing for every word he translates. Enraged, Chris yells at him again, but Ilya is unfazed. Alicia initially refuses, but seeing no other option, she reluctantly complies. Ilya translates a little, but the person on the radio still doesn't understand. He demands that Alicia keep removing clothing so he can continue translating. Chris, realizing Ilya is just playing games, finally snaps. He curses Ilya's mother, enraging him. Taking the opportunity, he yells for Alicia to run. He then releases his dog, sending it after Alicia. Dropping his gun, he chases after her himself. With Ilya distracted, Chris seizes the chance to grab the gun. However, when Ilya returns, he has a knife to Alicia's throat. He even cuts her slightly, warning Chris that if he shoots, he'll still have enough time to kill her. Later, just as Chris finally takes a shot, Ilya's dog unexpectedly jumps on him, knocking him off the landmine and into the ditch Alicia had been digging. The gunshot goes off but misses Ilya. Chris blacks out. When he regains consciousness, Alicia is beside him. Inside the ditch, Ilya looks down at Chris and reveals the truth. It was a fake landmine. He explains that real landmines are designed to detonate the moment someone steps on them, meaning their so-called friends had set this up as a cruel trick. With that, Ilya leaves with his dog, disappearing into the distance. Just then, Chris notices Alicia lying beside him, seriously injured and unconscious. He cries out for help, but no one comes. Much later, Tanya and Lika are seen chatting when Chris suddenly appears. Looking disoriented, he tells them he's lost and asks for directions. The women, being kind, happily point him in the right direction. When he also asks for a map, they gladly provide one, even taking the time to show him exactly where he needs to go. Chris, trying to linger longer, mentions that he's hungry and asks if he can eat with them. They invite him in without hesitation. At that moment, Ilya is seen outside, leaving his guard post and heading towards the house. It turns out the house belongs to him, and Tanya and Lika are his wife and daughter. As soon as he steps inside, he's stunned to find Chris sitting at the table. Chris pretends not to recognize Ilya, but Ilya immediately demands that he leave. Tanya and Lika are confused by his hostility. Chris, remaining calm, asks if he can at least finish his meal first. Ilya is visibly uncomfortable, but begrudgingly allows it. His unease is so apparent that even his wife and daughter notice. When Chris asks for more food, Ilya sternly tells Tanya not to give him any, then orders Chris to leave immediately. Chris obeys, politely thanking Tanya and Ilya before stepping outside. But Ilya isn't convinced. He follows Chris outside and warns him to leave his family out of whatever he has planned. He then suggests they settle things in an hour at a designated location. Chris appears to agree and walks away. As Chris departs, he releases his dog and sends it after Chris. He then returns inside, sitting at the table but unable to eat. Eventually, he gets up and heads to his room, considering calling emergency services, but in the end, he decides against it. Soon after, he notices something alarming. His dog has stopped barking. Sensing something is wrong, he rushes outside to investigate. Meanwhile, Chris returns to the house, carrying the dog's lifeless body. He coldly announces that he found it on his way and decided to bring it back. At that moment, Ilya spots the blood trail on the road. Panic surges through him, and he races home. When he bursts inside, he immediately dashes for his gun. Chris steps out to meet him. He shoots Ilya in the leg, causing him to collapse just as Tanya and Lika rush over, screaming. Chris orders them to carry Ilya inside. Once inside, he demands that Lika tie up her own mother. Tanya, desperate, tries to bargain, offering Chris money if he'll just leave them alone. But Chris isn't interested in money. He only wants them to obey. Ilya suddenly blurts out an apology. He claims he was drunk that night and that his actions weren't truly his own. Chris mocks him, picking up a bottle of wine and taking a long drink before passing it to Tanya and Lika. Then, without warning, he pours it over Ilya's open wound, making him scream in agony. Chris demands that Lika hand over her underwear. Ilya, horrified, yells at Chris to stop, but Chris forces her to comply. Then, in a final act of humiliation, he makes her crawl like a dog to retrieve it and then shoves it into Ilya's mouth. He warns Ilya that if he dares to remove it, he'll kill Lika on the spot. Chris then coldly recounts the fate of Alicia, how she succumbed to her injuries after Ilya abandoned them. He also reveals how he tracked Ilya down by finding his missing wallet. Then he prepares for a final sadistic game. He removes all but one bullet from his gun and tells them the rules. Lika must remove her clothes while he pulls the trigger. If she's lucky, the chamber will be empty. If not, Tanya and Ilya are frozen in horror. Ilya desperately pleads, begging Chris to do it to him instead. But Chris refuses. The game begins. Lika, trembling, takes off her dress. Chris cocks the gun and pulls the trigger. A loud gunshot rings through the air. Lika collapses, a bullet wound in her head. Tanya and Ilya scream in despair. Chris, however, doesn't react. The weight of everything seems to crush him all at once. He slumps against a wall, curling up, staring blankly into the distance. And that is how it all ended. So that's it. Hope you enjoy the story. Subscribe and press the bell icon for more videos.